The wind howled through the narrow streets of Bayhaven, carrying with it the scent of salt and the unmistakable threat of danger. Waves crashed violently against the docks, sending icy sprays into the air. The storm had come faster than anyone expected, and the small coastal town scrambled to secure boats and homes before the full force hit. Amidst the chaos, Calder Bristow moved with a calm precision that belied the fury around him. "Get inside!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. He helped an elderly woman onto the steps of the town's modest church, her hands trembling as she clutched his arm. Calder's weathered face, framed by a tattered raincoat, revealed nothing but determination. A scream broke through the din, sharp and desperate. Calder spun toward the sound and saw a fishing boat capsizing near the harbor's edge. A figure flailed in the turbulent water, the vessel tilting precariously. Without hesitation, Calder bolted toward the docks, ignoring shouts to stay back. The wooden planks were slick under his boots as he reached the edge. He tore off his raincoat and dove into the icy water. The cold stabbed at him like needles, but he pushed forward, his powerful strokes cutting through the waves. The struggling man, a local fisherman named Reggie, clung to a piece of debris, his eyes wild with fear. "Hold on!" Calder yelled, gripping Reggie's arm with an iron grip. Reggie gasped, his teeth chattering as Calder fought to keep them both afloat. The shore seemed impossibly far, but Calder didn't waver. Slowly, painfully, he pulled Reggie toward safety, the waves battering them relentlessly. When they reached the docks, hands reached down to help pull them up. Calder collapsed onto the planks, gasping for air. Reggie coughed violently, but his eyes were filled with gratitude. You saved me," he stammered, his voice shaking. Calder waved it off, sitting up and wringing water from his shirt. "Get warm," he said simply, his tone firm but kind. "Storm's not over yet." Eliza Hartswell watched the scene unfold from the shelter of a nearby awning, her notebook forgotten in her hands. The journalist had only been in Bayhaven for a day, but already she felt drawn to the enigmatic fisherman. There was something about him, something that didn't quite fit with the picture of a simple man living a quiet life. Her eyes drifted to his wrist as he put his raincoat back on. The faint glint of a gold watch caught her attention. It was old but elegant, the kind of item that seemed out of place on a man like Calder. Eliza jotted down a note, her instincts buzzing. This wasn't just a story about a storm. There was more to Calder Bristow than met the eye. As the storm raged on, Calder continued to move through the town, helping where he could. He reinforced windows with spare planks, hauled sandbags to protect the diner, and made sure everyone was accounted for. Each act of kindness was met with murmurs of appreciation, but Calder deflected every thanks with a curt nod or a quick retreat. By the time the storm began to wane, the town was bruised but intact. People gathered in the church to dry off and regroup, exchanging stories of close calls and narrow escapes. Calder sat at the edge of the room, quietly mending a torn net as others whispered about him. "That man's a saint," one elderly woman said, her voice hushed but firm. "Always helping, never asking for anything in return." "He's a mystery," muttered another. "Lives like he's hiding from something." Eliza leaned against the wall, her gaze fixed on Calder. She could see the lines of exhaustion on his face, but there was something else, something deeper. It wasn't just the storm that weighed on him. It was something far older and far heavier, and she was determined to find out what it was. As the rain finally eased into a gentle drizzle, Calder rose and walked out into the misty evening. He paused at the edge of the harbor, his silhouette framed by the remnants of the storm. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something or someone. Eliza stood in the doorway watching him go. She didn't know what secrets Calder Bristow carried, but she knew one thing for certain. This quiet fisherman was far from ordinary. The morning after the storm, Bayhaven stirred with a cautious energy. The town had weathered worse storms, but the damage this time left a lingering unease. Broken windows, toppled fences, and scattered debris told the story of a night when nature's wrath reminded everyone how fragile life by the sea could be. As Calder Bristow stepped out of his modest cabin near the harbor, he was met with the quiet stares of passers-by. They nodded their thanks, murmuring polite greetings, but their curiosity was unspoken and palpable. He'd been everywhere during the storm, hauling sandbags, rescuing Reggie, patching up whatever he could. For most, he was a godsend. For others, his constant willingness to help without question raised more questions of its own. Over at the Bayhaven diner, the heart of morning gossip, the storm wasn't the only topic of conversation. Calder's heroics the previous night had reignited old speculations. Sam Groves, the jovial owner of the diner, leaned against the counter, refilling coffee cups as the chatter grew. "Man lives like he's got nothing," a fisherman said, shaking his head. "But you ever notice how he's always got what someone else needs?" "I'm telling you," said another, voice lowered conspiratorially. "There's something off about him. Did you see that watch he wears? Looks like it's worth more than my boat." Sam frowned, setting the coffee pot down with a thud. "He saved Reggie's life last night. Maybe focus on that instead of what's on his wrist." The bell above the door jingled, and all eyes turned to Eliza Hartswell. Her crisp notepad was tucked under one arm, her expression thoughtful. She had spent the morning interviewing residents, piecing together the fragments of Calder's reputation. To some, he was a saint. To others, a puzzle they couldn't solve. But there was one consistent thread. Calder Bristow didn't fit into any neat category, and that alone made him fascinating. Eliza slid onto a bar stool at the counter. Sam approached with a smile, pouring her a cup of coffee. "You're the reporter, right? The one sniffing around?" "Observing," she corrected, offering a polite smile. "Though it's hard not to notice when someone like Calder stands out so much." Sam chuckled, leaning in slightly. "He's a good man, just doesn't talk much about himself. If you're looking for a story, though, you might want to try one of the other folks in town. Plenty of colorful characters around here." Eliza sipped her coffee, her mind already spinning. "What's his deal? Everyone seems to have an opinion, but no one seems to know much." Sam shrugged, but there was a flicker of something protective in his eyes. "Maybe some people deserve their privacy." Outside, Calder walked toward the market, his usual calm demeanor masking the weight he carried. He noticed Hazel Monroe sitting alone on the steps of the general store, her face scrunched in frustration as she fumbled with the chain on her bicycle. Without a word, he knelt beside her, his large hands deftly fixing the chain. Hazel looked up, her frown fading. "Thanks, Mr. Calder. How do you always know what to do?" Calder smiled faintly, brushing his hands on his jeans. "It's not knowing. It's just doing what you can." Nearby, Eliza watched from a distance, scribbling notes as the pieces of Calder's life began forming a pattern in her mind. He moved through the town like a shadow, always there when someone needed him, but disappearing just as quickly when the job was done. It wasn't just humility, it was avoidance. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza found herself walking along the harbor. The storm had left a few fishing boats damaged, their nets torn and their hulls scraped. Calder was there, of course, quietly mending a net as if the work itself could silence whatever was on his mind. "You're an enigma, Calder Bristow," Eliza said, stepping closer. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" he replied, tying a knot in the net with practiced ease. "Everyone in town has a story about you, but none of them seem to know yours. Why is that?" He paused, his hands stilling for a moment before he continued working. "Stories aren't always meant to be told. Sometimes they're just meant to be lived." Eliza's gaze lingered on him, searching for cracks in the armor. "And what about the ones that need to be heard?" Calder stood, his height casting a long shadow in the fading light. "Be careful, Miss Hartswell," he said softly, "because some stories can weigh more than you're ready to carry." He walked away, leaving Eliza alone by the harbor, the sound of waves lapping against the shore filling the silence. In her notebook, she underlined one word twice: "Why?" The town hall buzzed with a mix of curiosity and unease. Word had spread quickly about the visit from Evan Kingsley, a name that carried weight well beyond Bayhaven. The man had built his fortune on transforming small towns into luxury havens, and now his sights were set on the quiet, weathered streets of Bayhaven. Residents filled the modest room, some hopeful, others wary, as they whispered amongst themselves. Calder Bristow leaned against the back wall, arms crossed. His weathered features betrayed no emotion, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He watched as Kingsley strode confidently to the front of the room, a man in a tailored suit who seemed utterly out of place against the rustic backdrop of Bayhaven. His voice was smooth, practiced, as he greeted the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," Kingsley began, spreading his arms in a gesture of inclusivity. "I've heard so much about your beautiful town, and I must say, it's even more charming than I imagined." A smattering of polite applause followed. Calder's eyes narrowed as Kingsley continued, laying out his vision for Bayhaven, a luxury resort that would bring jobs, tourists, and prosperity to the struggling community. His words were carefully chosen, promising opportunity and growth while glossing over the costs that would inevitably follow. As Kingsley spoke, Calder's mind raced. He knew men like this, men who took more than they gave, leaving nothing but empty promises in their wake. The murmurs around him revealed the divide already forming. Some residents nodded in agreement, eager for the financial security Kingsley dangled before them. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their distrust matching Calder's own. When Kingsley paused for questions, a fisherman near the front stood. "You talk about jobs and money," the man said, his voice gruff. "But what happens to the people who can't afford to stay here when the tourists come in?" Kingsley smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand your concern," he said smoothly. "But with progress comes change. I assure you, those who embrace this opportunity will find a place in the new Bayhaven." The room grew quieter, the weight of his words sinking in. Calder straightened, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward. The room turned toward him, their collective attention sharpening. Calder rarely spoke at these meetings, but when he did, people listened. "You say, opportunity," Calder said, his voice steady but carrying a hard edge. "But what I hear is displacement. What happens to this town's identity when it's overrun by people who don't understand what it means to live here?" Kingsley's smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Mr. Bristow, is it? I appreciate your passion, but progress is inevitable. Surely you don't want Bayhaven to stay stuck in the past." Calder held his gaze, his own expression unyielding. "There's a difference between progress and erasure. This town doesn't need saving. It needs respect." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Kingsley's composure remained intact, but his tone cooled slightly. "I admire your dedication, Mr. Bristow. Perhaps we can discuss this further, privately." It was a veiled challenge, and Calder knew it, but he simply nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the room as Kingsley returned to his pitch. From her spot near the door, Eliza Hartswell scribbled furiously in her notebook. Calder's words echoed in her mind, not just for their conviction, but for the way they seemed to pierce Kingsley's carefully crafted facade. She could feel the tension between the two men, an undercurrent of familiarity that she couldn't quite place. As the meeting concluded, the crowd filtered out in clusters, their conversations buzzing with debate. Calder slipped out quietly, as he always did, but Eliza followed, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. She caught up to him just as he reached the docks. "You don't trust him," she said, more a statement than a question. Calder turned, his expression unreadable. "Should I?" Eliza hesitated, then shook her head. "Probably not, but it seems like you know more about men like him than you're letting on." For a moment, Calder didn't reply. Then, with a glance back toward the now empty town hall, he said, "It's not what I know about him that matters. It's what he'll take if no one stops him." Eliza felt a chill, though the night air was still. She watched as Calder walked away, his silhouette blending into the darkness of the harbor. Whatever his history with men like Kingsley, it was clear that Calder wasn't just protecting Bayhaven. He was protecting something far deeper. And Eliza was determined to uncover what that was. The early morning fog hung low over Bayhaven, shrouding the harbor in an eerie stillness. Eliza Hartswell moved quickly along the cobblestone streets, her notebook tucked under her arm. Sleep had eluded her after the town hall meeting. Calder Bristow's words lingered in her mind, but it wasn't just his defiance of Kingsley that kept her awake. It was the way he spoke, as if he carried the weight of something far greater than the town's future. She found herself standing outside Calder's cabin. The small, weathered structure sat at the edge of the harbor, surrounded by piles of neatly coiled fishing nets and patched-up buoys. It was unassuming, like the man who lived there, yet it held a magnetic pull she couldn't ignore. She hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was watching, then stepped closer. The cabin door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the space was sparse but meticulously organized. A cot was tucked in one corner, a small table littered with tools and a lantern in another. Eliza's gaze was drawn to a chest partially hidden beneath a tattered tarp. Something about it felt out of place in the otherwise utilitarian room. Her heart raced as she knelt and pulled back the tarp. The chest was old, its brass fittings tarnished with age. She hesitated before lifting the lid, as if crossing an invisible line. Inside, she found a collection of items that didn't belong in the life of a simple fisherman. A leather-bound notebook, photographs of a smiling woman and child, and a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the initials LB. Eliza's fingers trembled as she picked up the bracelet, its cold metal biting into her palm. Who were they? She glanced at the notebook, tempted to open it, but the sound of heavy footsteps on the dock froze her in place. Calder's voice, low and steady, drifted through the open window. "Not yet. Let him make the next move." Eliza quickly closed the chest and slid it back into place, her pulse hammering in her ears. She slipped out of the cabin and ducked behind a stack of lobster traps just as Calder stepped inside. He paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room. For a moment, he seemed to sense her presence, but he said nothing. Inside, Calder stood by the table, his expression darkening as he looked toward the hidden chest. He pulled the tarp back slightly, his jaw tightening. Eliza watched from her hiding spot, her breath shallow. Whoever LB was, they were more than just a memory. They were the key to understanding Calder's guarded nature. Later that day, Eliza confronted Sam Groves at the diner, her curiosity bubbling over. "Sam, what do you know about Calder's past?" she asked, leaning across the counter. Sam's jovial demeanor faltered for the briefest moment. "Not much to tell," he said, avoiding her gaze as he wiped down a coffee mug. "He showed up a few years ago, kept to himself, worked hard. That's all anyone really knows." "But there's more, isn't there?" Eliza pressed. "That bracelet in his cabin. LB. Who could that be?" Sam set the mug down with a clatter, his eyes narrowing. "You've been snooping, haven't you?" He sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Look, if Calder wanted his story out in the open, he'd tell it himself. Maybe you ought to let it be." Eliza leaned back, frustration gnawing at her. She had uncovered enough to know there was a story worth telling, but every door she tried to open seemed to slam shut in her face. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was closer to the truth than ever. That evening, she stood on the docks watching as Calder prepared his boat for the next day's fishing trip. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water. She approached cautiously, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Calder," she called softly. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Who's LB?" His hands stilled, the lines of his face hardening. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the hull of his boat. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and distant. "Someone I failed to save." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and Eliza felt a pang of guilt for prying. Calder turned back to his boat, his silence a clear dismissal. Eliza retreated, her thoughts swirling with more questions than answers. Whoever LB was, their story wasn't just Calder's to keep. It was a piece of the puzzle that might explain why this quiet fisherman carried himself like a man trying to outrun his past. The town square buzzed with uneasy conversation. Bayhaven, a place where time once felt still, was now a battleground of divided opinions. Kingsley's proposal had driven a wedge through the close-knit community, turning neighbors into adversaries. Calder Bristow stood near the edge of the square, his arms crossed as he listened to the voices growing louder. One side praised Kingsley's vision of a luxurious Bayhaven, promising jobs and prosperity. The other side, fewer in number but fiercely vocal, warned of losing the town's soul. "You think tourists care about us?" a wiry fisherman argued. "They'll take their pictures, buy their souvenirs, and leave us to deal with the mess." "But what else do we have?" countered another, his voice cracking. Fishing doesn't pay like it used to. My family's barely getting by. Calder's gaze shifted to Hazel Monroe, standing quietly next to her father. Her wide eyes darted nervously between the shouting townsfolk. Her father, swayed by Kingsley's promises, gripped her shoulder tightly. Calder frowned. The lines between who was for and against Kingsley blurred as desperation and hope collided. From the edge of the crowd, Eliza Hartswell watched with sharp focus. Her pen moved swiftly over the pages of her notebook, documenting every heated exchange. She glanced at Calder, who seemed rooted in place, silently absorbing the chaos. She stepped closer to him. "Are you going to let this happen?" she asked, her voice low. Calder didn't look at her. "What would you have me do?" "Speak up," Eliza urged, her frustration showing. "You know what this town means. You could make them listen." Calder finally turned to her, his jaw tight. "And if they don't?" he asked. "People believe what they need to believe. Right now they need a savior, and Kingsley looks the part." The crowd's volume surged as Kingsley himself stepped into the center, flanked by two assistants in tailored suits. His presence was magnetic, commanding. He raised a hand, and the crowd hushed. "Thank you, all of you, for coming together," Kingsley began, his voice smooth and confident. "I see your passion, your dedication to Bayhaven. That's exactly why I'm here. I want to make this town shine, to show the world what we already know. Bayhaven is special." Applause erupted from a section of the crowd, but Calder remained still, his expression darkening. Kingsley's words flowed like honey, offering hope wrapped in subtle manipulation. "Change is hard," Kingsley continued, his tone softening, "but it's necessary. Together, we can build a future where no one has to struggle anymore." The applause grew louder. Eliza leaned closer to Calder. "If you don't say something now, it'll be too late." Calder sighed, stepping forward. The murmurs quieted as the townsfolk turned toward him, their expressions expectant. Kingsley's smile didn't falter, but there was a glint of challenge in his eyes. "I've lived here for years," Calder began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I've seen this town at its best and its worst, and I'll tell you this, Bayhaven doesn't need to become something it's not to survive." The crowd shifted uneasily, but Calder continued. "Kingsley talks about progress, but progress doesn't mean selling our identity. What happens when the tourists leave? When the jobs aren't enough? What's left of the community we built?" A tense silence followed. Calder's words hung in the air, stirring both doubt and defiance. Kingsley stepped forward, his tone measured but pointed. "Change is inevitable, Mr. Bristow," Kingsley said. "Would you rather see Bayhaven fade into obscurity? We're offering a lifeline. Don't you want better for these people?" Calder met Kingsley's gaze unflinching. Better doesn't mean losing everything that matters. The two men stood locked in a silent battle as the crowd murmured once more, torn between hope and caution. Hazel tugged at her father's sleeve, her quiet voice drowned out by the noise. Calder caught her gaze, her silent plea cutting through the tension. As the crowd dispersed, Eliza lingered, her notebook clutched tightly. She watched Calder walk away, his shoulders heavier than before. Bayhaven was cracking under the weight of Kingsley's promises, and the man she thought had all the answers was struggling to hold it together. The wind was an ominous howl as another storm loomed over Bayhaven. Dark clouds swallowed the horizon, the sea restless and unforgiving. The town moved with urgency, tying down boats, boarding up windows, and bracing for the tempest. Yet amidst the chaos, the tension among the townsfolk was almost as palpable as the storm itself. Calder Bristow worked methodically, hauling sandbags to fortify the harbor's edge. His hands, worn from years of labor, moved with precision, but his eyes carried the weight of the past days. The fractures within Bayhaven, amplified by Kingsley's promises, were beginning to show. For the first time, Calder doubted if his quiet strength was enough to hold the town together. "Calder!" Hazel Monroe's voice broke through the wind, her small figure struggling to steady a loose tarp covering her family's boat. Calder hurried to her side, securing the tarp with practiced ease. "Thank you," Hazel said, her voice shaky but grateful. She hesitated, then added, "Dad says we should trust Mr. Kingsley. He says it's our only chance." Calder paused, his hands still on the rope. He looked down at Hazel, her wide eyes full of innocence and worry. "What do you think?" he asked gently. Hazel bit her lip, glancing toward her father, who stood a few yards away, deep in conversation with another fisherman. "I don't know," she admitted. I don't want us to leave." Calder's heart clenched, but he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We're not giving up Bayhaven," he said firmly. "Not without a fight." The first drops of rain began to fall, and soon the skies opened, unleashing a torrent. The townsfolk retreated indoors, but Calder remained at the docks, ensuring every boat was secure. The storm's ferocity built quickly, waves crashing against the harbor walls. It wasn't long before shouts rang out over the wind. "Help! Someone's in the water!" Calder's head snapped toward the sound. Through the sheets of rain, he saw a figure struggling near a capsized boat. Without hesitation, he tore off his jacket and plunged into the icy water. The cold bit into his skin, but his strokes were strong and purposeful. The figure was flailing, and as Calder got closer, he recognized the man, Evan Kingsley. Kingsley's face was pale, his movements weak against the relentless current. Calder grabbed him under the arms, fighting the waves to keep them both afloat. "Hold on!" Calder shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. It felt like an eternity before Calder managed to drag Kingsley toward the docks, where a group of men helped pull them to safety. Kingsley collapsed onto the wet planks, coughing and shivering, while Calder leaned against a post, catching his breath. You saved me," Kingsley stammered, his voice trembling. Calder's eyes narrowed. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said flatly, before turning away. The incident left the town buzzing. Some saw Calder's actions as proof of his selflessness, while others, emboldened by Kingsley's survival, rallied further behind the developer. The lines of loyalty blurred even more, and Calder found himself at the center of whispers he couldn't escape. Later that evening, as the storm subsided, Eliza approached Calder at the docks. He was mending a torn net by lantern light, his movements steady despite the weight pressing on him. "You didn't have to save him," Eliza said, her voice tinged with frustration. "He's the reason this town is falling apart." Calder didn't look up. "And what would I be if I let him drown?" Eliza shook her head, a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You're impossible, you know that." Calder allowed a faint smile. "Maybe. But the fight's not over yet." Eliza studied him for a moment, the light from the lantern casting shadows across his face. For the first time, she saw not just the quiet fisherman, but the weight of a man who had carried more than his fair share of storms, both within and without. The aftermath of the storm left Bayhaven quieter than usual, but beneath the stillness lingered unspoken tensions. The lines between trust and suspicion had grown sharper. Calder Bristow's selfless act of saving Kingsley had done little to quell the town's unease about their future. For Eliza Hartswell, however, the storm had uncovered something far more personal, a question that demanded answers. She sat at the diner, flipping through her notes. The pieces were there, scattered like puzzle fragments: the gold watch, the chest, the initials LB, and Calder's cryptic admission, "Someone I failed to save." Each detail whispered of a life far removed from the quiet existence of a fisherman. The connection between these fragments and Calder's present remained elusive, but Eliza was determined to uncover the truth. That evening, she found Calder on the docks, his silhouette framed by the golden hues of the setting sun. He was repairing a net, his movements steady and deliberate. Eliza approached, her footsteps soft against the worn wooden planks. "Calder," she began, her voice steady but probing. "I know you've worked hard to keep your past buried. But the more I see, the more I realize it's not just your past. It's the key to understanding why you're here." Calder didn't look up. "Some things are better left buried. But not everything stays buried," Eliza pressed. "I found the bracelet in your cabin. LB, who were they?" Calder's hands stilled, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor. He finally set the net aside and turned to face her, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. "Lila and Bethany," he said quietly. "My wife and daughter." Eliza's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to answer, let alone with such raw honesty. What happened to them? Calder's gaze drifted to the horizon, his voice low and measured. It was supposed to be a celebration, a deal I'd closed, one that would secure their future. But I was late, too busy basking in my success to notice the storm coming. His voice tightened. Their car slid off the road on the way to meet me. I didn't even know until the phone call, and by then, it was too late. Eliza's chest tightened, the weight of his confession pressing against her. "You blamed yourself," she said softly. "Blamed?" Calder laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "It wasn't blame. It was fact. I chose ambition over them, and it cost me everything." "And the money?" Eliza asked hesitantly. "The life you left behind?" Calder's jaw clenched. "What good is money when the people you earned it for are gone? I sold the company, gave most of it away, came here to disappear." Eliza struggled to find the right words, her usual sharpness softened by the weight of Calder's pain. "You think disappearing changes anything?" Calder's eyes finally met hers, and for the first time she saw the depth of his torment. "It doesn't," he admitted. "But at least here I can try to do something right. Help people. Maybe that's worth something." Before Eliza could respond, footsteps echoed across the docks. Kingsley appeared, his polished shoes incongruous against the weathered wood. His smile was disarming, but his eyes carried a predatory gleam. "Evening," Kingsley said smoothly. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Calder's expression hardened. "What do you want?" "Oh, just a friendly chat," Kingsley replied, his tone light but with an undercurrent of menace. "You and I seem to share a knack for survival, but I can't help but wonder, how long can you keep pretending to be something you're not?" Eliza's breath hitched. Kingsley's words hung heavy in the air, cutting through the fragile understanding she'd just begun to build with Calder. Calder stepped closer, his frame tense. "Leave it alone, Kingsley." "Relax," Kingsley said with a smirk. "I'm not here to cause trouble, just observing. It's fascinating how secrets have a way of coming to light, don't you think?" With that, Kingsley turned and strolled away, his presence leaving a chill in the air. Eliza turned back to Calder, her thoughts racing. "He knows, doesn't he?" she asked. Calder's silence was answer enough. Whatever past Calder thought he'd left behind was no longer just his burden to carry. It was now a weapon, one that Kingsley seemed all too ready to use. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of Hazel's absence. She wasn't at the docks that morning, nor was she darting around the square like usual, offering her bright smiles to anyone who'd look her way. Calder noticed, though he said nothing, filing it away with the quiet concern that had become second nature to him. It wasn't until later, as the afternoon sun dipped lower, that he found her father, Harold Monroe, pacing outside the small clinic near the town square. Harold's usual gruff demeanor was cracked, his face pale and drawn. Calder approached cautiously, his voice low. "Harold, is Hazel all right?" Harold looked up, his expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She's sick. Fever hit her hard last night. Doc's in there now, but..." His voice broke and he turned away, pressing a hand to his face. Calder felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Hazel was more than just a child of the town. She was its light, its innocence, its hope. He couldn't imagine Bayhaven without her laughter filling the air. By the time Calder stepped into the clinic, he found Eliza sitting in the corner, her notebook abandoned on a chair. She looked up at him, her eyes shadowed. "It's bad," she said quietly. "They're trying to stabilize her, but she needs more care than what this town can offer." Calder moved to the doorway of the examination room. Inside, Hazel lay small and pale on the cot, her hair damp with sweat. The doctor murmured softly to her, but Calder barely heard the words. All he could see was the fragility of life, so easily lost, so easily taken. "She's a fighter," the doctor said, looking up as if sensing Calder's presence. "But we need to get her to a hospital. The treatment she needs isn't something we can handle here." "And the cost?" Harold's voice was rough as he stepped into the room. The doctor hesitated, his silence louder than any reply. Harold swore under his breath, his fists clenching. "How am I supposed to pay for that? Kingsley's offering money, but it'll come at a cost I can't stomach." He looked at Calder, desperation in his eyes. "What am I supposed to do?" Calder's chest tightened. He had seen that look before, in the mirror, years ago. It was the look of a man willing to do anything, sacrifice anything to save someone he loved. He turned and left the room without a word, his mind racing. That night, as the town settled into uneasy silence, Calder stood by the harbor, his hands gripping the railing. The stars above were indifferent to the turmoil below, their light cold and distant. Calder felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, the memory of Lila and Bethany intertwined with Hazel's fragile form. Eliza found him there, her presence quiet but certain. "You're thinking of doing something reckless, aren't you?" she asked. Calder didn't reply at first, his gaze fixed on the water. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Sometimes doing what's right doesn't come cheap." Eliza stepped closer, her tone sharper. "You don't have to fix everything, Calder. You're not alone in this." He turned to her, his eyes heavy with pain and resolve. "I can't lose another child, Eliza. Not if I can stop it." Before she could argue, he walked away, leaving her standing there with 1,000 unspoken words. By morning, Harold would discover an anonymous payment made to the clinic, enough to cover Hazel's treatment and then some. Calder would say nothing, as he always did, but his absence at the docks that day would speak louder than words. In the stillness of the next evening, Hazel's fever began to break. Her small voice cracked as she whispered, "Did Mr. Calder come by?" Harold brushed her hair back, tears pooling in his eyes. "He's always here, Hazel. Even when you don't see him." The air in Bayhaven felt heavier than usual, a tension creeping through the town like a rising tide. Kingsley's influence was spreading, subtle but undeniable, as more residents began to entertain his promises of prosperity. Whispers of deals and documents circulated, fueled by the silent desperation that had taken hold of the town. Calder Bristow watched from the edges, his unease growing with each passing day. He had seen men like Kingsley before, charming, calculating, and always playing the long game. But even Calder wasn't prepared for how far Kingsley would go. It started with a letter. Eliza Hartswell found it slipped under the door of her rented room at the inn, written on expensive stationery. The message was short but pointed. "Perhaps you've uncovered more than you realize. Let's talk. Ike." Eliza frowned, turning the letter over in her hands. She knew Kingsley was dangerous, but this was the first time he had acknowledged her directly. The timing was no coincidence, coming just days after Hazel's illness and Calder's mysterious donation. She tucked the letter into her bag, her resolve sharpening. If Kingsley thought he could manipulate her, he was sorely mistaken. The next day, Kingsley hosted a private meeting at the town hall. Only a select few were invited, including Harold Monroe, the owner of the diner, and a handful of other influential residents. Calder wasn't on the list, but that didn't stop him from lingering nearby, his sharp eyes scanning every face that entered. Inside the hall, Kingsley stood at the center of the room, his polished smile as bright as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and reassuring, "I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me. You are the pillars of Bayhaven, the people who keep this town running, and I want you to be the first to benefit from the opportunities I'm bringing." He laid out his vision in detail: luxury resorts, high-end boutiques, and a thriving tourism industry that would put Bayhaven on the map. He spoke of jobs, investment, and the promise of a brighter future. But beneath his words was a carefully orchestrated deception. "You'll find everything you need in these agreements," Kingsley said, handing out glossy folders to the attendees. "Sign now, and you'll secure your place in Bayhaven's future." Harold hesitated, flipping through the pages. "What about those who can't afford to stay?" he asked, his voice edged with uncertainty. Kingsley's smile didn't waver. "I assure you, Mr. Monroe, my team has considered every angle. We'll work to accommodate everyone." But the fine print told a different story. Hidden within the contracts were clauses that would effectively force lower-income residents out of Bayhaven, making way for Kingsley's vision of exclusivity. It wasn't just a redevelopment plan, it was a calculated takeover. Outside, Calder caught snippets of conversation as attendees began to leave. Their expressions ranged from excitement to doubt, but the undercurrent of fear was unmistakable. He stepped forward as Harold emerged, clutching the folder tightly. "What did he promise you?" Calder asked. Harold looked away. "He says it's our chance to make something better, to give Hazel a future." Calder's jaw tightened. At what cost? Inside her room that evening, Eliza spread the contents of her own folder across the table, her sharp eye catching every loophole and hidden clause. The picture Kingsley had painted was clear, and it was a lie. The question was how to expose it before it was too late. Later that night, Calder found Eliza at the harbor, her notebook in hand. She looked up as he approached, her expression grim. "It's worse than we thought," she said, holding up the contract. "If people sign these, they'll lose everything. He's setting them up to fail." Calder took the papers, his eyes scanning the damning words. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but his voice remained calm. "Then we need to stop him." Eliza hesitated, her gaze searching his face. "Do you think the town will believe us?" "They will," Calder said firmly, "because this time, I'm not letting him win." The resolve in his voice left no room for doubt. As the waves crashed against the harbor and the wind carried the faint hum of the town's unease, Calder and Eliza prepared for the fight ahead. Kingsley's deception was deep, but Calder knew the heart of Bayhaven, and he wasn't about to let it be torn apart. The fire erupted in the dead of night, a sudden inferno that lit up the sky with a wicked orange glow. Smoke curled into the air, thick and choking, as the flames consumed Sam Groves' diner, the heart of Bayhaven's community. Shouts rang out as townsfolk scrambled to contain the blaze, their fear and confusion palpable. Calder Bristow was one of the first to arrive, his sharp instincts leading him to the scene before the alarm had fully spread. The heat was searing, the crackle of burning wood deafening as he rushed to help Sam, who stood frozen at the edge of the chaos, his face pale with shock. "Sam," Calder called, grabbing the man's arm. "Is anyone inside?" Sam shook his head, his voice breaking. "No, I locked up. But it's all gone, Calder. Everything." "We'll deal with that later," Calder said firmly, his eyes scanning the scene. "Right now, we need to stop this from spreading." Townsfolk poured in, buckets in hand, forming a desperate chain to douse the flames. Eliza arrived moments later, her notebook forgotten as she joined the effort, her hands blistered from the rough wood of the bucket handles. The fire, however, seemed insatiable, each drop of water swallowed by the roaring heat. Through the chaos, Calder noticed something off. The flames weren't spreading naturally. They had a strange, methodical pattern, as if the fire had been guided. His suspicions deepened when he spotted a charred, empty gas can discarded near the building's back door. "Arson," he muttered under his breath, the realization hitting like a punch to the gut. Kingsley. The name was a storm in his mind, a fury he struggled to contain. He couldn't prove it, not yet, but the pieces fit too perfectly. The diner was a cornerstone of resistance against Kingsley's plans, and now it was ash. Calder's hands tightened into fists, the weight of his growing rage tempered only by the immediate need to protect the town. Hours passed before the flames were subdued, leaving behind a smoldering shell of what had once been the diner. Exhausted and covered in soot, the townsfolk lingered in the square, their faces etched with grief and anger. Sam sat on the curb, his head in his hands. "How could this happen?" he whispered. "Why would someone do this?" Calder crouched beside him, his voice low but steady. "We'll find out, Sam, and when we do, they'll answer for it." Eliza approached, her expression grim as she held out her phone. "I caught something," she said. "Footage of someone leaving the diner just before the fire started. It's blurry, but it's a lead." Calder's jaw tightened as he watched the shaky video, the figure barely distinguishable but unmistakably deliberate in their movements. It wasn't enough to go to the authorities, not yet, but it was a start. The next morning, as the sun rose over the scarred remains of the diner, Calder gathered with a small group of townsfolk. Their voices were hushed but resolute. The fire had shaken them, but it had also ignited something else, a determination to fight back. "We rebuild," Calder said simply, his voice carrying an edge of defiance. "And we don't let fear decide Bayhaven's future." Eliza stepped forward, her notebook once again in her hands. "And we expose the truth," she added, her eyes meeting Calder's. "Whoever did this, Kingsley or not, they won't get away with it." The crowd murmured their agreement, a flicker of unity reigniting amidst the ashes. But Calder knew the battle was far from over. Kingsley's tactics were escalating, and the fire was just the beginning. As he walked away, his thoughts burned as fiercely as the flames that had consumed the diner. Bayhaven wasn't just a town anymore, it was a battleground, and Calder Bristow was ready to fight. The sea was calm that morning, its surface mirroring the gray clouds above. Calder Bristow stood at the edge of the dock, his hands resting on the railing. The air was thick with salt and tension, the kind that settled after a storm but before the rebuilding began. Behind him, the ruins of the diner cast long shadows over the harbor. The whispers had grown louder since the fire. Some believed Calder had provoked Kingsley with his defiance, while others simply blamed him outright, their frustration seeking an easy target. Calder felt the weight of their stares, their suspicion, as if the town he had quietly worked to protect now saw him as an outsider. Eliza found him there, her approach marked by the soft sound of her boots on the planks. "You're leaving," she said, her voice more statement than question. Calder didn't turn. "It's what they want." "No," Eliza said firmly, stepping closer. "It's what Kingsley wants, and you're playing right into his hands." Calder's jaw tightened. "Bayhaven doesn't need me to fight its battles. It needs peace, and right now I'm the reason it doesn't have that." Eliza's frustration flared. "That's not true, and you know it. You've been their anchor, Hazel, Sam, all of them. They're scared, but that doesn't mean they don't need you." He turned to face her then, his eyes heavy with resignation. "And how many more fires will there be, Eliza? How many more people will suffer because of me?" Her reply caught in her throat. She wanted to argue, to convince him that staying was the right choice. But the pain in his expression silenced her. He wasn't just leaving for the town. He was leaving because he believed it was the only way to protect them. That afternoon, Calder packed his few belongings into a weathered duffel bag. The cabin that had been his refuge for years now felt hollow, its sparse contents a reflection of the life he had tried to rebuild. He lingered by the chest in the corner, running a hand over its lid. Inside were the memories he couldn't escape, the photographs, the bracelet, the echoes of a family he had lost. Before he could dwell too long, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Hazel standing there, clutching a small handmade card. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes wide and pleading. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Calder knelt to meet her gaze. "Sometimes, leaving is the best way to help." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes as she thrust the card into his hands. "You can't go. You're the only one who believes in us." He opened the card, its simple, childlike handwriting spelling out, "Thank you for being our hero." Calder's chest tightened, but he forced a small smile. "You're stronger than you think, Hazel. You don't need me to believe in you." As Hazel left, Calder slipped the card into his bag, its weight heavier than it should have been. He stepped out onto the dock, his departure unnoticed by most, save for Eliza, who watched from a distance. She didn't stop him this time. She knew his mind was made up. The boat pulled away from the harbor, the town growing smaller with each passing moment. Calder stood at the bow, the wind biting at his face. His heart ached with the knowledge that he had done what he thought was right, even as it tore him apart. For the first time in years, he felt truly alone. Back on shore, Hazel clutched her father's hand, watching the boat disappear into the horizon. "Will he come back?" she asked softly. Harold sighed, his voice low. "He'll come back when he's ready." Eliza stood by the harbor, her notebook forgotten in her hands. She stared at the empty horizon, a determination building within her. Calder might have left, but his story wasn't over. Not yet. The town square was alive with a subdued kind of unrest. Rumors swirled in hushed conversations, voices dropping when Kingsley passed by with his entourage. Despite his polished demeanor, Kingsley's eyes betrayed a sharp awareness. He knew the tide was turning, even if only slightly. and Eliza Hartswell was determined to make it crash over him. She sat in the diner, its charred remains still visible through the windows. Sam Groves worked quietly behind the counter, his movements slower than usual, his spirit worn thin. On the table before Eliza lay her weapon, documents, photographs, and a damning paper trail she had spent weeks assembling. Every late-night call, every contact she could muster, had led to this, proof of Kingsley's corruption. "Sam," she called softly, glancing over her shoulder. "Are you ready?" Sam sighed, wiping his hands on a towel before joining her. "I don't know, Eliza. I'm not like you. I don't know how to make people listen." "They'll listen to you," she said firmly. "This is your town. Your voice carries more weight than mine ever could." Sam looked at the papers, his expression conflicted. "What if it's not enough?" "It will be," Eliza replied, though her voice carried a quiet determination that masked her own doubts. She needed this to work, not just for the town, but for Calder, wherever he was. She refused to let him carry the burden of failure. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the townsfolk gathered in the square, drawn by whispers of something important. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, her pulse steady but her mind racing. She scanned the faces, catching Hazel's hopeful gaze, Harold's guarded expression, and Kingsley's carefully neutral mask. Sam stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice hesitant but steady. "But this can't go on. What's happening to Bayhaven? It isn't right." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Sam unfolded a copy of the documents Eliza had given him. Kingsley's promises, jobs, growth, a better future, they're all lies. He's not here to save this town. He's here to tear it apart. Kingsley's smile faltered, his composure slipping. "Now, Sam," he interjected, his tone smooth but sharp, "let's not jump to conclusions." "These aren't conclusions," Sam shot back, his voice rising. "They're facts. Contracts that force families out of their homes, deals that strip this town of everything it stands for, and you've been hiding them behind your slick words and false promises." Eliza stepped forward, her own voice cutting through the growing tension. "And it doesn't end there. Financial records, offshore accounts, and payouts to silence anyone who got in your way. It's all here." She held up the papers and a hush fell over the crowd. Kingsley's face darkened, the charm in his smile replaced by something colder. "This is slander," he said tightly. "None of that will hold up." "Then why not let the town decide?" Eliza challenged, her eyes locking with his. "If you're so confident, why not let them see the truth for themselves?" The crowd murmured again, the tension palpable. Hazel clutched her father's hand, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mr. Calder always said the truth matters more than anything." The mention of Calder's name sent a ripple through the crowd. For a moment, Kingsley hesitated, as if calculating his next move. But the tide had already turned. The townsfolk began moving toward Sam and Eliza, their anger and determination outweighing their fear. Kingsley stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Fine," he said coolly. "Let the people decide, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Kingsley turned and walked away, his exit was shadowed by murmurs of defiance and quiet resolve. Eliza watched him go, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline coursed through her. Later that night, as the square emptied, she sat alone on a bench, her mind replaying the events over and over. Sam joined her, his expression lighter than it had been in weeks. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," she corrected. But her gaze drifted toward the horizon where the sea met the sky. She couldn't help but think of Calder, wondering if he felt the shift, wherever he was. For the first time in weeks, the weight of his absence felt less suffocating. The truth had been unveiled, and with it, the first real hope for Bayhaven. The sun rose over Bayhaven with a quiet promise, its golden rays stretching across the town like a warm embrace. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, as if the collective weight of secrets and fear had begun to lift. The square, once a site of tension and whispered doubt, now buzzed with purpose. Townsfolk gathered in clusters, their voices filled with hope instead of despair. Eliza stood near the center of the square, her notebook in hand, but her thoughts elsewhere. The evidence against Kingsley had ignited something in the people, a fierce determination to reclaim what was theirs. Yet even as the town rallied, A nagging ache pulled at her. Calder's absence was a shadow she couldn't ignore. "Miss Eliza," a small voice called. She turned to see Hazel running toward her, clutching something in her hands. It was a bracelet, simple, silver, and familiar. "Where did you get this?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad said Mr. Calder left it for us," Hazel replied, her wide eyes full of innocence. "He said it's a reminder that he's always watching out for us." Eliza's throat tightened. The bracelet wasn't just a trinket. It was Calder's way of saying goodbye. But she couldn't accept it as an ending. Calder's story wasn't over, and neither was his role in Bayhaven's future. By midday, the square was transformed into a makeshift assembly. Sam Groves stood at the forefront, flanked by Harold and a few other prominent townsfolk. The tension was palpable as they awaited a response to the petition they had sent to the state, demanding a formal investigation into Kingsley's practices. When the announcement came, it was swift and decisive. Kingsley's permits were suspended, his contracts nullified pending a full inquiry. The crowd erupted in cheers, the collective relief almost tangible. For the first time in weeks, Bayhaven felt like it belonged to its people again. Amidst the celebration, Eliza found herself standing by the docks, the sea stretching endlessly before her. She clutched Hazel's bracelet, her mind replaying every moment she had spent with Calder. His quiet strength, his unspoken grief, and his relentless determination to do what was right. It all led back to this moment. "Thinking about him, aren't you?" Eliza turned to see Sam approaching, his expression knowing. "He'd be proud," she said softly. "Of you, of all of this." Sam nodded, his gaze distant. "He's out there somewhere, probably thinking he's done enough, but he hasn't." He paused, his voice firm. "This town isn't just his burden to carry, it's his home." Eliza felt a flicker of resolve ignite within her. "Then we'll bring him back, one way or another." As the sun dipped lower, casting the town in hues of amber and gold, the people of Bayhaven gathered in the square for a small celebration. Music played, laughter filled the air, and for the first time in months, the future felt bright. Hazel danced among the crowd, her laughter carrying above the music. Eliza watched her, a bittersweet smile on her face. In the distance, past the edge of the docks, a lone figure stood on a rocky outcrop. The sunset cast his silhouette in sharp relief, his presence almost ghost-like against the vibrant sky. Eliza's breath caught as she stepped forward, her heart pounding. But when she reached the edge of the dock, the figure was gone, leaving only the sound of waves lapping against the shore. She clutched the bracelet tightly, a silent vow forming in her heart. Calder Bristow may have left Bayhaven, but his presence was woven into the fabric of the town. Redemption wasn't just a single act, it was a journey, and no matter how far he ran, the dawn would always lead him home. Bayhaven's streets felt different now. There was a pulse to the town that hadn't existed before. A new energy flowed through the people, a shared understanding that they were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. The storm had left its scars, but it had also cleansed something deeper. Something had changed in the air, in the hearts of the people. Eliza walked through the square, watching as vendors set up their stalls, as children ran across the cobbled streets with laughter that rang like music. There was a sense of unity, a quiet strength that hadn't been here before. It wasn't just about the business deals, the contracts, or the promises. It was about the people reclaiming their sense of ownership over the town they loved. "Miss Eliza," Hazel called from across the street, waving enthusiastically. Eliza smiled and walked over, her heart lifting at the sight of the young girl, her energy infectious. Hazel had changed in the weeks since Calder's departure. She had grown more confident, her eyes brighter as if she had finally found her place in the world. She wasn't just the girl who had been left behind by tragedy, she was becoming the future of Bayhaven. "How are you today?" Eliza asked, crouching down to Hazel's level. Hazel beamed. "I'm helping with the community garden today. Everyone's been planting new things for the fall. It's going to be the best one yet." Eliza's heart swelled. It was the kind of thing Bayhaven had been lacking. Purpose, collaboration, a shared effort to rebuild from the ground up. It was a testament to how much the town had changed, and yet how much it had stayed the same. The heart of Bayhaven was still beating strong. As the day went on, Eliza wandered through the town, feeling more grounded in the reality of what had been accomplished. The old diner had been rebuilt, a modern yet familiar structure that honored the history of the town while embracing the future. The streets were busier than they had been in months, with new businesses popping up and old ones getting a much-needed facelift. But even with all the change, the shadow of Kingsley loomed, his plans halted for now. The people knew the battle wasn't over. His name still hovered in the background, a reminder of the power struggles they had faced. But there was a collective resolve now, a sense that no matter what happened next, they could overcome it together. At the edge of the docks, Eliza spotted Sam Groves, his hands busy with a fishing net. He noticed her approach and waved, a rare smile pulling at his lips. "You know," Sam said, leaning on the dock, "I never thought I'd see Bayhaven like this again. Not after everything." "I think we've only just begun," Eliza replied, her voice steady but filled with hope. "There's more work to do, but we're headed in the right direction." Sam looked out over the water, his gaze distant but content. "It's funny, isn't it? How something good can come out of something so bad." Eliza followed his gaze, watching the sun setting over the horizon. "Maybe that's the way it's always been. We just have to remember that it's worth fighting for." The distant sound of footsteps interrupted their quiet moment. They turned to see Harold Monroe approaching, his hands in his pockets, a slow but steady gait. Hazel was just behind him, beaming, and her excitement was palpable. "Harold," Eliza greeted him with a warm smile. "We've got something to show you," he said, his voice surprisingly light. He looked over at Sam, who nodded. They walked together toward the newly planted community garden, where Hazel eagerly pointed to rows of vegetables and flowers, the care evident in every patch of earth. Eliza's eyes softened as she took it all in, how far they had come, not just with the land or the buildings, but with the people. They had rediscovered something they'd lost, their sense of community, of belonging. "This," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what we're fighting for. Not just for us, but for our kids, for the future." Eliza glanced around at the people working together, their faces bright with pride and joy. It was the kind of day that reminded her why she had come to Bayhaven in the first place. For all the uncertainty, for all the battles fought and won, this moment felt like the beginning of something new. And maybe, just maybe it was. The town of Bayhaven had never felt more alive. There was an air of anticipation hanging over the square as the townsfolk gathered for the annual Harvest Festival, a tradition that had always been a celebration of the community's spirit. But this year it was more than just a harvest. It was a victory. Hazel Monroe stood nervously at the entrance to the festival, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. The crowd buzzed around her, their laughter and chatter fading into the background as her thoughts swirled. She had won the national writing competition, an achievement that had seemed impossible only months ago. Her story, inspired by the people of Bayhaven and the town's fight against Kingsley's corporate takeover, had resonated with judges and captured hearts across the country. But for Hazel, it wasn't just about the prize. It was about proving something to herself and to the town. She had spent so many years feeling small, caught in the shadow of loss and fear. Now she was standing on the edge of something bigger than herself, and it felt like the world was finally starting to recognize the power that had always been within her. Her father, Harold, stood beside her, his pride clear in his eyes. "You did it, Hazel," he said softly. "I knew you could. I'm so proud of you." Hazel smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this, Dad. What if they don't like it?" "You've already done the hardest part," Harold said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've shown them your heart. That's what matters." Eliza approached from behind, her ever-present notebook tucked under her arm. "Hazel," she greeted with a warm smile, "I'm so proud of you." Hazel blushed slightly but straightened her shoulders, taking a deep breath. "Thanks, Eliza. I'm just nervous." Eliza's eyes softened. "You've already made a difference in this town. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, least of all yourself." But Hazel wasn't so sure. As the crowd gathered to hear her read, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about winning a contest. This was her moment to show Bayhaven what it meant to rise above the past and stand strong in the face of adversity. To show that despite everything they had been through, they still had a future worth fighting for. When Hazel's name was called, the crowd went quiet. She walked to the podium, the piece of paper trembling in her hands. The lights of the stage felt blinding, but her father's reassuring presence at the front of the crowd grounded her. She took a deep breath and began. I wrote this story because Bayhaven is more than just a place. It's a community, a place where people come together to help each other, even when everything seems lost. When our town was threatened by people who didn't understand us, we didn't back down. We fought for each other. Her voice shook at first, but as the words flowed, a quiet strength filled her. She spoke of the people she had met, Calder, Eliza, Sam, and everyone who had worked to protect the town from Kingsley's influence. She spoke of the fires, the hardships, and the moments of courage that had united them all. And she spoke of the hope that now filled the town's streets. When I look at Bayhaven now, I don't see just a town rebuilt, Hazel continued. I see a community reborn, and I'm so proud to be a part of it. The crowd erupted in applause, and Hazel's heart swelled with emotion. She wasn't just a girl who had written a story anymore. She was a voice for Bayhaven, for its strength, for its future. The feeling was overwhelming, like the town's heartbeat had become her own. As the applause subsided, Eliza stepped forward, a proud smile on her face. Hazel, she said, you've shown us all what it means to fight for what's right. You've given us hope. Hazel nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. We've all done it together. The night carried on with celebrations, but Hazel knew that the true victory wasn't in the award, or the applause, or even in the recognition from others. The true victory lay in the unity of the town, the promise of a future built on strength, love, and unwavering support for one another. And as the festival lights twinkled in the distance, Hazel realized that the story of Bayhaven had only just begun. The sun broke over Bayhaven with a softness that seemed almost miraculous. The town that had faced fire, deceit, and division now stood on the edge of a new beginning, its streets slowly waking as the first light of dawn touched its shores. The energy in the air was different now, charged with hope, with possibility. The darkness that had loomed over them for so long had finally begun to lift. Eliza stood by the harbor, watching the gentle waves ripple under the early morning light. She had always thought Bayhaven was a place that lived in the shadows of the past, but now she could feel the weight of those shadows retreating. The town was finally reclaiming itself, and with it, the people had found something they hadn't had in years: faith in each other. Behind her, the sound of footsteps drew her attention. Hazel approached, her face more confident than it had been in months. "Good morning, Miss Eliza," she said brightly, her eyes gleaming. "Good morning, Hazel," Eliza replied, her voice filled with warmth. "How's everything at the community garden?" "It's amazing," Hazel said, her smile wide. "We planted so many flowers yesterday, and now it's starting to look beautiful. People have been stopping by to help. It's like everyone wants to be a part of it." Eliza smiled, her heart swelling with pride for the young girl who had become the voice of change in Bayhaven. "That's the spirit of Bayhaven," she said softly. "It's all about coming together, isn't it?" Hazel nodded enthusiastically. "I think we're finally seeing what we can do when we all work together. Everyone's pulling their weight, and it's making a real difference." As they stood there, watching the town come to life, Eliza felt something stirring within her, a sense of completion, a sense of peace. It was the kind of feeling that came only when you knew you had done something worth fighting for. And Bayhaven, the community, was worth every bit of effort they had put in. Later that day, Eliza made her way to the town square. It was busier than usual, the streets filled with people chatting, laughing, and sharing the stories of their newfound hope. The town had begun to rebuild itself, not just in brick and mortar, but in spirit. New businesses were opening, old ones were revitalized, and there was a collective desire to see Bayhaven not just survive, but thrive. She found Sam at his booth, setting up for the day's market. His face was weathered, but there was a new light in his eyes. He looked up as Eliza approached, his usual gruff demeanor replaced with a rare smile. "You've done it," Eliza said, her voice full of admiration. "Bayhaven's going to be all right." Sam gave a short laugh, shaking his head. "It's not just me, Eliza. It's everyone. They've come together in a way I didn't think was possible." Eliza's eyes lingered on the people passing by, men, women, and children, all of them united in purpose. "I think Bayhaven has always had this strength," she said quietly. "It just needed someone to remind it." "Maybe," Sam agreed, "but I think it needed someone to lead. And you've been that someone." Eliza turned away, her gaze sweeping over the square. She didn't feel like a leader. She felt like a part of something bigger, something that had always been there, just waiting to rise. She hadn't been the only one who had fought. The entire town had risen together, and now they would carry the future forward. As the day wore on, the sense of unity grew stronger. People gathered at the community garden, worked at the local businesses, and sat together in the square, sharing meals and stories. The sense of belonging, of family, was everywhere. There was no longer any space for fear or division. And as the sun began to set on another day of hope and promise, Eliza found herself standing by the same harbor where everything had begun. The quiet stillness of the water, the town aglow in the soft light of dusk, felt like a new chapter, one where Bayhaven was not just a place, but a living, breathing testament to what a community could do when it stood together. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead. But Bayhaven was no longer just a town, it was a family. And together they would face whatever came next. What do you think of Calder's actions? Did he make the right choice, or did he leave Bayhaven too soon? Share your thoughts in the comments. This story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. Thanks for watching.